Okay, hi. So welcome to virtual coffee chat. This time with Canadian author and artist Jacob Wren. And for those of you who don't know, I think most of you do, but at this point, but this is a series of chats that I've curated from people that did blurbs for my book, The Mortality Shot. Yay. Okay, so some of you, probably a lot of you have already read it. And oddly enough, to introduce Jacob, I'm going to introduce his blurb and I'll explain why, even though, of course, it's self-serving that I start this way. Um, he wrote, these stories and essays plus a stage text push up against heartfelt questions of life and death in ways that are complex, counterintuitive, humorous, and striking. Writing against the grain in varying styles and intensities, The Mortality Shot goes places that so much current literature wouldn't dare, demonstrating that real writing is always a risk and a gamble, and that only through taking such risks can we get at the things which truly matter. And the reason I wrote that is oh good, you let that person is that I think that's what Jacob does as well. So it's one of those the take one to know one blurbs, which most of my blurbs have been, to be honest. I mean, I've only asked people whose work I like. And I met Jacob through online. I mean, so many people I've met through social media, which seems like the most uninspired way to meet people. And yet it's amazing how that's happened. And we were just talking, there are people we know in common from the UK and stuff. And we just have a general milieu of both having done performance and I don't know if you'd call your stuff theater. So I don't want, I'll just leave it at performance. I call mine theater. Um, and moving into, or always, and you were I didn't realize, but Jacob's been kind of working between the two all along, and just the relationship between those two things. And what I think is really interesting is when writers or artists of any kind take the time to just figure out what way that story slash idea slash project needs to be embodied, right? Like sometimes it's one way, sometimes it's another, sometimes it's some weird combination of both of them. So having said that, I'm going to just hand it over to Jacob to talk a little bit about his own work and introduce himself. Go for it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, what do I do? Yeah, so I've been making performances and writing for, I think, about 35 years now. I've been thinking about that a lot, how long I've been doing it and how to continue. It's been very much at the forefront of my mind these days. And I co-run a performance group in Montreal called PME Art. PME doesn't stand for anything, but as a fun game, we make up things it can stand for. For example, pretty much everything, prisoners, murderers, entertainers, perfection made easy. And yeah, we make performances based on being yourself in a performance situation. I started in theater, or what we used to call experimental theater back then.
Yeah, that's
People
what I
don't
still
use
call
that
them.
term so much anymore, but for sure, I definitely relate to people who come from this tradition of experimental theater and wanting theater to be different and different ways of making theater, thinking about how theater can be like something other than theater and what that means and why we would want that. And then, yes, I also write novels. Or I mean, I always wrote books, but before the books were maybe more fragmented or hybrid or hard to describe. And around 2010, I started trying to make them a little bit more like novels, though they're still quite fragmented and hybrid and unusual. But there's something about like calling it a novel and having it be read that way that creates a certain energy around it that I'm interested in.
Yeah, and I would say like I at first when I was reading Polyamorous Love Songs, which I think you're going to read from, so that's the one I read. And at first I thought it was really it was so funny because I was like, oh, I guess these are just different things and they sort of interlink. But then I realized, no, this is actually a novel. Like it really is. And you're right, there is this energetic thing. So while it shifts a lot in terms of points of view and in terms of where are we and what decade are we even in and you know all these kind of things, you begin to, and it takes a while, of course, to realize how they all link together, which I really love, by the way. I loved that. And it was just fascinating to me, though, to watch my own little journey through it, kind of thinking. And I think partly just because, I have tried to write novels, and I've written some that may or may not be whatever, but the only thing that's so far gotten published is the Mortality Shot, which is in fact separate things that creates hopefully a whole, but it's not a whole thing in the same way that Polyamorous Love Songs is. So I was fascinated by that. And then also, and Jacob's going to read from this, so it won't sound so abstract what I'm saying. What I also really loved was, your way of linking in, I mean, it's more in, filmmaking, so-called, but and the interesting ideas of what that could be. And so it almost feels like you've placed filmmaking in the role of theater, if you will. I don't know if that makes any sense, but and so just that. And I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit before you read, or whether you'd like to read whatever feels best.
Yeah, I mean, my last book was a book I wrote for the 20th anniversary of PME Art, and it's called Authenticity is a Feeling. And for sure, I mean, both in the writing and in the theater or performance work, I'm trying to get at some feeling of authenticity, which would be, of course, different for me than for someone else. But yeah, I'm looking for something that to me feels real, or feels like it's really happening, or feels live, or feels alive. And for sure, one of the plots in Polyamorous Love Song is this idea of the new filmmaking, where they decide to make films without filming anything. And
Yes.
instead of filming the films, living the films, and calling that filmmaking.
Right.
So, and yeah, it's very resonant with, in a way, what I want art to be, or what I'm disappointed that art can't be. Or one of the reasons I want to be part of art is this craving for something that feels both alive, but also better than life, in that it's also art.
Yeah, no, I get that. I mean, that was when I was, for those of you who don't know, I had a theater company. Well, I had one briefly in New York, but I had one longer time in London called Apocryphal Theater, which, as you can imagine by the title, was attempting to stride that line, and looking at those kind of ways of almost shocking ourselves, not in the sense of, it wasn't like violent or anything, I don't mean that kind of, but I mean just in terms of shifting different ways of reality around, so that it became clear that it was sort of a mutable thing. Exactly. Like, in other words, that definitely no one was seeing the same show, because the way we did it, there was no unified field, but there was something happening. And it's very interesting, that whole kind of project. And then, and I had never even thought about it as, I know this is gonna sound ridiculous, but even though I write stage text and stuff, I didn't even think of it as something I could do necessarily in the writing per se. But as you're speaking, I realize that is part of, and that's why this is what was so interesting about getting author blurbs, because I was like, really? Am I really doing that? Like, I didn't know that. And it was like this kind of moment of like, oh yeah, I'm kind of trying to do the same thing, even in a more seemingly traditional format. And because if you're engaged as a reader, I guess, because I'm not reading it from the outside, it keeps shifting frameworks and shifting things. So you're getting all these different, that's what I've been getting as feedback, the kaleidoscopic view of mortality and what it is, and grieving, and all the things that we start thinking about at our age as we get older, and having in our face. So yeah, cool. So I would love it if you would read. Are you going to read from the beginning?
Maybe I'll read the last chapter.
Oh, okay. You're changing it up. Awesome. I love that. Good.
No, I thought that's what we had decided on, but anyway, I can
Oh,
read
I thought I got confused. No. Read the last. No, definitely do.
Okay, this is from
Oh,
chapter 9 of Polyamorous Love Song, and it begins this way. The most effective lie is always the one closest to the truth. The closer, the better. A dream is not true, but is never a lie. There are various approaches for understanding dreams, as evidence of some deeper psychological truth, as alternate realities, as subtle yet surreal mental reprocessings of our daily lives, as experiences equally valid to those had while awake. Due to the acuity of their strangeness, dreams practically call out for interpretation. However, since we don't accurately know what consciousness is, since we don't know precisely what or how we experience being awake, why would we be able to know what happens when we dream? There are also various approaches one might use for understanding a lie. But one aspect generally agreed upon is that to tell the complete truth, and only the complete truth, at all times, is a disaster. There are different ways of being honest. This is a dream about the day Paul decided to start writing down his thoughts. Prior to that moment, he had felt there was no point. Thinking was an end in itself. There was no need for it to be recorded or glorified. But then, suddenly, he was writing books, publishing them. For a moment, this shift felt like a betrayal, like he was betraying his former self. But then, at the same time, it felt positive, like a positive shift in his life. What is this concept of selling out? Is it better to hold fast to one's former ideas, or to be open to new ways of thinking about oneself and the world? If I am working as an activist to protect if I am working as an activist to protect the environment, and a large corporation offers me a job with a generous salary to do things that will essentially harm the environment, then the situation feels rather clear. But if I believe in not making art and then later change my mind, the parameters of the compromise are somewhat more ambiguous. Art complicates everything. During these years, Paul thought a lot about the question of betrayal. Though, to say the least, it has a nasty reputation, there was some sense in which betrayal was essential. To use the simplest possible analogy, if you're living in 30s Germany and all your friends are joining the Nazi party, the best thing to do would be to betray their trust in order to fight for something else. But of course, nothing in real life is so simple. And here he was using Nazis again, his perennial but least favorite example. He was haunted by a line he once read in an interview with Genet. Anyone who's never experienced the pleasure of betrayal doesn't know what pleasure is. Was this the pleasure he was experiencing when he finally decided to reject his former conceptions around thinking and instead produce? Of course, the Nazi example was somehow wrong-headed, was using the word betrayal not in its usual sense. One did not betray a community or society. Against an entire society, it was not betrayal, it was treason. Treason was a form of betrayal, but that was another kind of question. No, one betrayed a friend or lover, one betrayed trust. And yes, perhaps it was also possible to betray an idea. He tried to remember. What was the exact idea he now felt he had betrayed? What were its dimensions? What precisely had it felt like? Just then the phone rang. It was Sylvia. They had been living apart for the past few years, but they'd been talking about living together again. Her book had been a striking success, considerably more successful than his own. This had created tension between them, and they decided to live in separate cities for a while. It alarmed him how petty he could be, or insecure. Back before he was making art, he never remembered being so insecure. But perhaps, in itself, the decision not to make art was a form of insecurity. As they talked, Paul noticed how great Sylvia sounded. He never remembered her being so convivial and relaxed when they were living together. There had always been an edge in her voice, in her stance, and now he thought that discomfort had basically come from him, or from the dynamic between them. But we'll see each other at the book fair in New York. That's true. It'll be nice to spend some time together in New York again. Did I tell you I got asked to write an article about the mascots? I'm sorry? An article for Atlantic Monthly about the mascots. how they've changed strategy, been spotted in Portugal, Egypt, Japan. Paul thought back to the crumpled photograph he used to carry around in his jacket pocket. He couldn't quite remember when he had first found it, maybe when he was 20, 21. At the time, the mascots had represented something for him, something absolutely pure. They were artists and not artists. They were absolutely loyal to something even more absolutely absurd. They risked their lives. There was a conviction even more essential than his own previous compulsion not to make art. He knew so little about them. He didn't like the idea of Sylvia writing about the mascots, publicizing them, questioning them. For Paul, the mascots were best back when he first heard about them, when they were barely a rumor, hardly existed. But as he continued to speak on the phone with Sylvia, he chose not to share these concerns. He didn't want to fight anymore, knew his criticisms cut more deeply than intended. Were they really going to live together again? Around that time, I was thinking a great deal about pop music. I had the idea that most already existing love songs, mainstream or otherwise, were directed towards one person, the ultimate soulmate or new excitement, and maybe a polyamorous love song, a love song directed toward a few or many soulmates, might undermine some basic songwriting assumptions. I dreamed of these not yet existing love songs, wondering what they would actually sound like, who might write them, and who might listen. Pop music is the gasoline of monogamy. Love songs are propaganda for monogamy. Writing is another form of loneliness. These are all statements that feel relatively true, that feel true in their gestures of empty, highly personal provocation. Statements whose truth value is little more than an opening for debate. Songwriting is a strange kind of writing. I remember something I once heard Darren Hayman from the band Hefner say in an interview, that people often complimented him on his lyrics, and he was flattered by this, but he had always been more interested in writing tunes, because a song could have bad lyrics and a great melody and still be a good song. But if a song had great lyrics and a terrible melody, the entire endeavor was kind of doomed. How would we experience love if pop culture did not exist? And maybe I will stop there.
Great. Oh my God, that's just so beautiful. Oh, so many thoughts. Yeah, I mean, I read it, but just listening to you, it's just so interesting because again, talking about performance, like hearing things read aloud, right? There's like this whole other embodiment. I love the whole thing about the dream and the lies, and also just calling out for interpretation is so interesting because especially with dreams, because as you well know, they've been interpreted so differently historically. It's like
Yes.
it's really right, like how like it's only relatively recently they became this sort of psychological thing, and before that it was like augury or something. So just very, very different. And I just love the line, art complicates everything. just like that line alone is just so great. And then I don't know if you want to talk about this at all, but I just love the whole trajectory of like, I'm not even gonna, do art because like that would be bad. And then, going, so that whole question of betrayal thing, do you want to talk about that at all a little bit? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think I always have the feeling that the best way to be an artist is not to be an artist. I There's always something about like, maybe it's about my fantasies around art are so much better than any art I make or see, or what I want art to be is so much more than art actually is. So yeah, and it's some sort of I'm not a purist. I only like hybridity. I'm against anything pure, but maybe I have fantasies of some sort of art that's more something, more what I want it to be than actual art.
Mhm.
So for sure, whenever I'm making anything or thinking about making anything, this idea that to make it might be okay, but not to make it could be better.
Right. But it's interesting though, because I also liked how you also then interrogate that with like, art made him insecure, but then maybe there was an insecurity in not making it at all, which, you know, I kind of can see too, you know what I mean? Like, cause it's like, there is no, it's like, what is it, like the platonic ideal or something of an art piece or whatever. And of course, I, in theory, I totally understand exactly what you're saying, and it makes perfect sense. But then again, and I granted, I coach people to get them to do stuff, so like this is coming partly from that, to be honest. But like, it's just that, is that as a friend used to say, you can't rewrite a blank page. I mean, it's like if you're not putting anything out there, even if it's perfect in your mind, in a sense, then you're not only, you're not even monogamous, you're monotropic, there's nothing, like nobody can connect with it in any way, maybe. Yeah.
Yes, and then yes, I mean, for sure, there's a kind of cowardice in not producing anything, but I also, and that's maybe a more conventional way of looking at it, but I also always feel maybe there's a kind of bravery in not producing anything in this
Yeah.
world where we're expected to produce, and where producing things is considered your value or your worth, and to say no, I'm just living is enough, I don't need to produce value. But I mean, that's not what I do. I mean, I see that as a kind of fantasy or ideal, but I mean, I've produced enormous amounts of art in my life and can't seem to stop, so that's also probably one of the reasons I romanticize it, because I always think, yes, the way I'm doing things is one way, but there could be some other way that's not that doesn't involve producing things and could be a different, the art of living or something, if we take the cliche version.
Yeah, no, and I totally get that, and believe me, I understand it. I mean, I've even tried it, and it just failed miserably every time. But so I just, because I think, but I really do think you're onto something with the productivity thing, because of course that's the capitalist model, right? And just the endless drive to produce, and you're always on social media, critiquing social media, it's the same kind of thing of just like, here I am doing this, why am I doing this? It's killing me. Here I am doing this, why am I doing this? It's killing, and it's just like that kind of endless cycle that social media, in my opinion, has made even worse. And I'm not going to judge anyone, because I get sucked into it as much as anybody. So I'm not going to sit here and be like, well, it's just that it's incredible, because it creates this, what I notice is when I'm kind of stuck on that loop, and this is how I got to know you, seeing your stuff, so that's why I'm talking, is like, I realize I'm in this loop of eternally trying to get something it's never going to give me. It's like I'm looking, and I finally stopped myself once and just started writing down, like, what are you trying to get? And I realized I was really trying to get connection. I really, really wanted connection, something real,
Yeah.
something. And I was like, wow, this is exactly the opposite of that, though. Like, and yet it's this tantalizing, like, and maybe I'll just connect, and maybe I'll just connect, but then it was also good to see, because then I at least could have some compassion for what I was looking for, and kind of, and I was able that day to kind of back away and ask myself, well, are you getting that from this? Not in a mean way. And then realizing no, and I was able to back away, but then again, it's also just part of my life, and part of my work is being on it, so it's all like, it's very, so in that regard I completely 1,000% relate, because how do you participate in that without ending up sucked into that logic, that capitalist logic? It's very hard.
And what you're saying about social media, I think, is also very true for me about art. In making art, I'm trying to get some connection, and even when people like my work, I don't feel it achieves that. I feel it.
Mm.
The work is a kind of barrier between me and the person receiving it. So it
Mm.
very similar to social media. The thing I want it to do is the thing it prevents happening.
Hmm. Well, it's interesting, because you find, and I find the same thing with social media, like I actually connected with you. I have actually connected with actual people. There are moments in art, I would say, and in social media, where an actual connection does happen, right? So maybe that's also the bait. It's not that, like, I've seen moments in my work or with other people that it really is, there is, it's not, and it's not going to solve for X or whatever in my life, but it will be a moment. There are these moments. So it's not maybe as binary as there isn't or is now that I'm thinking about it. Maybe that's why, because there are moments of it.
Yeah.
Where things break through. It sounds like what you're really trying to do, and I'm trying to do in my way too. And it's just very interesting, isn't it? Like how that and I find, I didn't know when I was going to get into it now, but I will. The neurodiversity piece that I've realized recently, as most everyone who knows me knows by now, that I'm autistic. And that, came about a couple of years ago. And then it's suddenly like I realized how much of a mask my work was. And then I tried to think about what is masked and unmasked text and rhetoric. And I think my stage texts are more unmasked, frankly, than any of my prose writing still. But that interesting thing about communicating through a system, that autistic people call either allistic or neurotypical, depending on whether they're talking about all people that are not autistic or people who don't have a neurodiversity profile of any kind. And you're trying to communicate something. And I didn't realize all the barriers. And I also didn't realize that I was using it as a way to, in other words, it was more, in the best sense, it's the Artodian mask, right? The mask that allows you to communicate, kind of like what you're doing with, I would say, with the novel, like there's you and then there's you kind of in other people, like you're, what I mean? Like it seems like you're in it, then you've got quote fictional characters that are also kind of you, which is kind of like the dream logic thing. At least that's how I read it. I could be totally wrong, but that's how I read it. And so it feels like, you're moving through these things in a way to get to something. And in a way, trying to get to it utterly directly is almost impossible, which I think you also said, like trying to say everything. I can't remember. Anyway, you're basically trying to say everything exactly the way it is a disaster, because how can you? And especially because words are an approximation as it is. So, yeah.
I mean, I was also thinking that if you try and say everything exactly as you see it, you hurt a lot of people's feelings, and that creates more barriers towards communication than if you consider their feelings and let that affect how you talk about things that concern them.
No, that's absolutely true. And in fact, one of the things I realized, again, I've tried to mitigate over the years, is what I refer to, and now I find out as part of being autistic, is what I call honesty Tourette's. It's like where I'll say, and I won't think about, and I actually don't have any interest in hurting people, but like I realize I've said things that have, and I haven't even meant that is literally the last thing on my mind, but because I just think I have to say this thing, whatever it is, my truth, like it's just, and it's horrible. Like it's a horrible feeling, because then you're just like, oh no, like I really, that, yeah.
And at the same time, society absolutely needs people to speak that truth. And also in another way, our culture is dying from a lack of it. So
Yes.
So where is where are the places where we can speak those truths, and where are the places where they'll be hurtful in ways that won't allow people to hear them? And yeah, it's a very, there's a lot of important things in that.
There are, yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you
Well,
stated it, at this moment. Maybe now would be a good moment for you to read from the Morality Shot.
from the morality shot, the mortality shot, you mean?
Uh,
The morality
well,
shot
there
one.
is a Freudian
That's
slip that will,
hilarious.
yes,
That's really funny.
yes.
God forbid I write that. Now I have to write that, right? Now I have to write like the follow-up is now the moral, anyway, whatever. So because we were talking about this idea, betrayal and these different things about what's important and what is, and Jacob had thought, and I agreed when I looked at it, that an ode to irresponsibility might be an interesting thing to read. So I won't read all of it because it's long, but I'll read parts of it that I think are relevant to this conversation. So I'll read the beginning, because if I don't, it won't make any sense. On an island in Scotland where you go to fall ever more deeply into yourself, a place where distractions fall away like so much confetti, and after some days, you finally happen upon that elusive, on the verge of extinction creature, yourself. You're contemplating why you cannot think of a word for the quality of presence of sitting next to someone when you both know they're dying, but whose dying is not imminent. It isn't mortality because you aren't the one dying. There are words such as holding vigil or accompanying for sitting with someone in their last days or hours, but nothing you could find for the more liminal space of sitting with someone over the course of weeks, months, or even years between their diagnosis and their last days. You've communicated with others who have experienced this, and none of them have a name for it either. While there may very well be a word for this in another language or culture, though you could not find one, perhaps because diagnostic technology makes this a relatively modern phenomenon. You wonder if you couldn't find such a word, in part because in your world that is obsessed with productivity, it seems there's little acknowledgement of the need someone might feel to share with a beloved the undefined and unpredictable time and space between life and news of impending death. So you begin to consider the word for being totally present while sitting near someone who is dying is in fact irresponsibility, because mortality calls on you to do what you need to do in that moment, whatever it is, regardless of external responsibilities. And if you think about it, the only time you don't care about all these things is either when you're engaged in a creative project or someone is dying. When your childhood and young adult mentor and best friend and person who helped raise you, for which there is no name because he was your third father's best friend in college and they were both gay but not partners, and so what is that? But he was your chief witness and protector during times of many troubles. And when he died far too early at 51, frighteningly quickly, of pancreatic cancer, you were so glad you had let go of your theater company a couple months earlier so you could just be there for him. If you had been responsible, you would have been not present, but instead you were. What Walter saw when you were growing up was a young child who had to make her own breakfast because her parents were still asleep, generally hungover, except when he was visiting and you would have English muffins together, and get herself to school, who was dumped in a dangerous place with a woman who had a psychotic break and almost killed her, followed by her custody being thrown to her unwilling father like a hot potato, who moved to California without her and dumped her at his parents' house on their fold-out sofa for 2 years because he, quote, couldn't deal with it. He saw a girl who nonetheless achieved always, was top of her class at all the schools she attended, got scholarships to a fancy boarding school and university, and was always responsible. This is why she was never happy. But everyone thought she was doing just great. Walter knew better. You would sit with Walter for hours, as you had with your grandmother Janie when you were 16 years old, and you spent her last summer together at a family cottage in Maine, sharing a gentleness she had never allowed herself with you, and many silences. She was trying to finish a book before she died, and your memory of someone regretting time not spent with their creative self before dying too young seared into your consciousness like a warning. You were not with Janie when she died, but you had a fever and had written a poem you did not understand in some kind of automatic handwriting. Only when your mother called your boarding school and tracked you down at the Emily Dickinson retreat in Amherst, where you and some of your classmates were staying with your happily free-spirited 11th grade English teacher with long, wild white hair and a younger lover, did you realize that you had written that poem the moment Janie had died. You had felt her soul enter you, an urgency not only to write the poem, but also for your own life that would manifest in the coming years as reckless desire, creative work, and a lot of traveling that did not look like the more orderly path you had originally paved for your frightened younger self, but that you would never regret because you allowed yourself for the first time ever to be irresponsible, even if in a messy way. And then I'm just going to kind of go closer to the end because it's long, but I just want to say, I'm just going to do the last bit because it's important. The last time you saw him in October, a little chillier, but the orange, red, yellow leaves just beginning to fall from the trees, the New York mid-autumn side lighting making each edge seem heartbreakingly beautiful, and you sat with him in his apartment for hours, looking out his window as he slept and woke and slept and woke. He said softly between consciousness and sleep, "I don't want to leave you." You believed your own hype at the time, so did not understand what he meant. You felt you were doing just fine, no idea that even as imperfect as he was, Walter was the ground beneath your feet. and that when he died, you would feel adrift for many years, and to some degree still do, and that he knew that. After he died, you had strange visions of him coming out of his grave and kind of haunting you, like he wanted something from you. And to some degree he had when he was at his worst and drunk, but he had not shown that side to you in many years. After you had stopped drinking and confronted him with the words he had said to you in blackout, he had been horrified and made sure when he saw you from then on to be sober. And so he was not grasping that day when he said he didn't want to leave you. You know this now, so many years later. He meant he knew you needed a witness. And when he died, the one person who was present over the years, but that had not left you alone in scary places and expected you to survive, but knew that had happened, the one person who had asked time and again of your parents, but what about Julie? The one person who could tell you, no, you are not crazy. You're doing the hardest thing of all when you're trying to write your first book or create your own work, would go with him. Because he did support you as an artist and writer. He just didn't like to see you be responsible for everyone else, like when you were running a theater company or trapped in a bad marriage because you thought you weren't allowed to leave. He knew you needed a break. He also knew you needed a witness. Only now, 20 years later, on an island where the Atlantic and North Sea meet, in the land and water and wind and sky itself is a kind of witness, offering you space to allow yourself. Can you accept the gift of his mortality, what he wanted you to have that he could not give himself because of his own burdens, the permission to indulge in exquisite irresponsibility? So there's that. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or.
Yes, when you're talking about running a theater company and caring too much for other people, it really too close to home for me. Really hard to hear that.
It's rough. I mean, now I'm self-employed and run all my own stuff, and I have coaching and this and that. I'm doing this now again. I'm giving myself, starting next week and starting next month, starting in April. God, Jesus, brain. I have a brain. I used to have a brain. In April, for 6 months, I'm giving myself a sabbatical, and I'm starting at that same place in Scotland just to work on my writing. Because I'm so, there's a version of autism which is called hyper empathetic. And so for me, it's like if I'm sitting in a room or even on a Zoom call and somebody's feeling something, I feel it too. So it's this constant bombardment, and it's very tricky. I'm sure you understand this. And so yeah, it's exhausting. Like no matter how great a thing is, I'm sure your group is fantastic and it's so great that it's still there, but it can be vampiric, I think. And it makes it very hard, those kind of responsibilities. Like literally the only reason I was able to hang out with Walter as much as I did is I had happened to have, shit canned that theater at that point. Like there were a lot of reasons for it that didn't have anything to do with him, but I didn't have it hanging over my head. So all I had was my dumb little job at a law firm at night, my part-time legal secretary job, and I was diddling around with some workshops and stuff, but I didn't have that constant, endless drone of responsibility. And that's why I called it irresponsibility, is like, because that's what you get, like when you're in that state, like when you're, and yet when somebody is dying, like he was, like, it's one of the very few times, and even then people don't always understand, but it's the one time people can kind of understand why you're pulling out of the responsible world.
Yeah, I mean, also like this idea, like when you're an artist, you're supposed to be focused on the art. But then, yes, if you're running a company, there's all these things that have nothing to do with art that take up enormous amounts of time that are necessary for the art. So in some sense, focusing on them is also focusing on the art. But in other ways, focusing on all the other things is neglecting the art. And it's a very tangled, a very straight, and also people who've never done it don't really know what you're talking about. There's only like a very small group of people who have any idea what I'm talking about when I'm trying to explain these things. And I don't know what I'm talking about in a way, because I feel like when you get really deep into it, you sort of don't know what you're doing anymore in some way. Like you don't know what you don't know if the horse is pulling the cart or the cart is pulling the horse. You don't know what the core of it is, or what the actual like point of it is in a way. And then yes, we get invited a lot of places and we go and we perform. But so maybe that's the point, but it doesn't. I don't know. On the daily basis, it doesn't seem like that's the point. It seems like that's like something on the side that we, I don't know. It's very funny.
I get it. I mean, like, this little book comes out, this hybrid book,
Yes.
the Mortality Shot, not Morality Shot, just to be clear. But like, but I just think that's so funny still. And okay, so it's a hybrid book. I have some, whatever. It's a small publisher, and so it's not like I had this huge it's not like some big publishing, extravaganza, and I have to go on a book tour. But even the stuff I have had to do to just kind of get it out there and has felt like this. I'm just drained, and it's like it's the same thing. It's like I want people to read the book, because if I wrote the book and no one reads the book, what's the point? It's sort of, but at the same time, it's literally the exact opposite energy that it took to write anything in that book, So it's, but yet, if in it, I think this becomes even more true, ironically enough, or I don't know if it's ironic, but the more experimental or whatever the word is you want to use about the work, it becomes more that, because you're more likely to be a cottage industry, you're more likely to be self-producing, or if not, like this wasn't self-published, but it's a tiny publisher, so I have to do a lot of work because they can't. I mean, that's all there is to it. So but that, because they're the small publisher, they're willing to take the risk on the book. So that's, so it's also that too. And so it's like, so to get the kind of support I see other people get, you have to write much more traditional stuff. So, but am I going to ever write that? Probably not. So, it's just like, and it's like some snobby. It's just like, this is not what I write. I mean, it's like, if I could, I would, I don't know, maybe I wouldn't, but I don't, but I get that. Like, that's also one of my favorite lines in this book, which is not from the essay I just read. It was about the death of my cousin. Dragonfly Time was about, like, there's no perfect way to die and there's no perfect way to live either. And I think as I'm getting older, I'm going to be 60 in a few months, which is just mind blowing to me. I'm just not really sure how to even cope with that, to be honest. It's like, okay. Because I think for a long time, I kept thinking there was this, like, okay, so this is the way, or you do it this way, or like, it's like, either don't make the work or you make the work, or you do, and I think that's not a thing. I'm realizing now, it's taken me a while, a little slow to these things, that's not a thing, that it's this balancing, it's this not knowing the course card thing. Maybe that is just being our, I don't know precisely how old you are, but like, just in that middle agey period of like, oh, okay, so this isn't going to resolve into some like, I'm not going to suddenly like get the answer and then be like, okay, I'm arrived, I don't know.
I remember reading, it was some musician who got a Lifetime Achievement Award, and another musician who had gotten the same award a few years later, said to him, "Yeah, I think that's what they give you when they want you to just kind of go away."
Oh God, there's that part too. Yes. So then there's this other thing of like realizing what you thought was so, out there and interesting or whatever, that now it's like old fashioned. Like I'm still trying to wrap my mind, because as I dropped out of that world for a while to write this long book that I'm still trying to get published and have almost gotten published a number of times, about my grandmothers. It's a long story, which I won't bore you with, but that, and I did that in part. I was actually going to ask you what got you to start writing your longer stuff, because for me it was the death of my father, weirdly enough. Like, my father died, and I just rearranged my set for a lot of reasons, and I suddenly was looking at all this stuff about my grandmothers, and just, it became this whole, I just became obsessed with very different things, and it just shifted, everything just went junk, and I just was like, And every time I went into a theater, it used to be the most energizing place. And every time I went into it, I was exhausted. And now I would probably, it was autistic burnout, but like, and I think my father was autistic actually and didn't know it because there's no way he would have. And so I feel like when he died, it was just something happened and I couldn't even read. Actually, interesting. When he first died, I had literally just gotten my PhD about 3 weeks before, and he died and I couldn't read on a page. And I barely knew him and we had a very distant relationship, but it was like the double grief. It's like I'd lost him, then I lost him, you know? And so any hope of it ever being something, it was gone. And so what am I talking about? So I think these kind of losses over time, like they shift things. I don't know about you, but these tectonic shifts, and then suddenly I'm focused on something else. And I think I lost my ability to mask. I just couldn't do the mask anymore. And I didn't know what I was masking, mind you, but I did have this back of the mind feeling until my diagnosis of when are the wheels going to fall off this cart?
Mm.
When are they going to fall? Like I wrote the piece I just read before I knew, but it's like there's just this sense of what, so that's actually what I'm writing about now. I'm writing a memoir, and that's why I want the time off, because I need time to kind of process this massive shift. I have no idea why I went off on all that. Why did I even start that conversation? I hope it made some kind of sense. Does that have any resonance for you at all? I don't know.
Yeah, many different resonances. Yes, I mean, for sure, this idea that I was going to reinvent myself as a novelist, even though I'd been trying and failing to write novels for all the years previous to that, had something to do with how ephemeral performance is, and with the feeling that, I'd made an enormous amount of work and I didn't really have anything like to hold in my hand. And, I didn't even really know that many people who had seen it or remembered it. Um,
Yes, I know that feeling.
and it was like, yeah, and yes, and I'd written some like weirder books, and they had like circulated much more than I ever thought they would, very slowly. So it was like, yeah, I mean, I published a book in like 98, maybe, is that right? Yes. And then like 10 years later, somebody wrote me like and said, I'm living in Brazil and I just saw it in a used bookstore in Brazil and bought it randomly. And they wrote me a long thing about it. I was like, how? It's 10 years. It came out 10 years ago. No one read it. It obviously has no distribution in Brazil. How did it get there? How did this person read it? What happened? And then I thought how that could never happen with a performance. And, if somebody's watching a performance I'm doing, I know about it, I'm there. And if no one's in the audience, I also know. So there was this feeling like, oh, books. I mean, of course, I have always loved books, but books have some weird way of traveling through word of mouth, through someone reading it and saying, here, you have to read this, through, all sorts of like very hard to identify ways that books, change hands and find their people and find their readership, that I became more and more intrigued with the more books I published.
Yeah. And they have a kind of interesting presence. One of the plays that I directed in the UK was called Besides You Lose Your Soul, or the History of Western Civilization. And the vision I had for the set, which then happened, was that it was a friend of mine who was down. I was here during 9/11, and another friend lived right near the place, and so they had a little bit of a kind of a balcony, and it had like about 7 inches of the ash from the towers was there, and I'll just never forget seeing that. They saw much more horrific stuff than that, but I just saw that, and it was that plus I just got a million books, literally, I mean, thousands of books from these used bookstore places or places that were giving away books. But all the books, the rule was they all had to be before World War II. They had to be pre-irony. I was like, I needed pre-irony books. They all had to be. And so that was actually hard, but like I was, defined like the age of irony. You know, there was definitely had to be before World War II. World War I arguably began it, but still, I was willing to go to there. But anything, but just the presence of all those books, you know, there's something, or like I have this huge bookshelf in my, you can't see, my study area, and you know, everybody's like, oh, you should give away books. I'm like, there's no planet on which I'm giving away my freaking books. Like, you know, you don't understand. Like, that is not happening. Like, those are my life. That's my entire life there. You know, I brought them from here to the UK, back from the UK to here, you know, and and it's just, and I like physical books, you know, and there's something there, they are a presence, right? There's something like a bookstore is just a glorious place, isn't it? Like, you can feel all the energy of all those things.
Yes. And I mean, when I was starting making performances, in a way, it was that ephemerality that seemed to be the reality or the art.
Yeah.
I still, I don't know. Actually, I don't know if I believe in that anymore. I definitely feel very, very confused about if I still need, I mean, also, there's something about social media that seems very live, like somebody posts something and you see it immediately. Uh,
Hmm.
it has a kind of, I mean, I think when I was young, I would have said that the opposite of the liveness I'm looking for. But now I see, like, yeah, there's something alive about that, you know, that person, you know, types, you know, I just ate an egg. And, you know, I'm at the same time I can read that they just ate an egg. And it's not like I have to show up at a certain time at a certain place, you know,
Yeah.
to see them tell me that they just ate an egg. There's this like there's this kind of immediacy, and it's also like very fucked up because it's owned by multinational corporations, and I'm against it. And but also it has some of this liveness that I was searching for in art.
Well, and it's got an international ability. That's the other thing. Like, we wouldn't be having this conversation if it weren't for flipping Zoom. You know, it's like I now have workshops with people from all over. You
Yeah.
know, like it's on the one hand, it's expanded access in a lot of ways too. And so, yeah, and I haven't really, except for once, I haven't really been in a theater since COVID because I got COVID long haul and all that. We won't go there, but that's part of, well, that's part of why I wrote this book, because I had my own brush with mortality. And so I'm not all about like, let's go into a room together. It's like, I'm not all about that right now, you know. So I'm still very hesitant. So yeah, so that whole thing is not, but so, and I feel like you, I mean, sometimes I really miss that ephemera. I know exactly what you're talking about. And that was my whole thing. I mean, literally, even as a theater director, I had actors improvise my way through my book stuff. I didn't even stage it in the end, even though I'm really good at staging stuff. We created tools, and so that every single performance was different. Every single performance, you know, so uh that's, you know, even though there was a text, it still was always different because different actors said different lines and they said in different ways, and or if they rewrote them by accident or on design, and like, you know, so like all kinds of stuff happened. uh and I loved that, and I do love that, but at the same time, um yeah, it was the same thing. X number of people would be there and then it was over. And yeah, so there's something, and there's that, well, who are those X number of people? And they have to know something about something to get there in the first place, and yada, yada, yada. There's a whole kind of exclusionary aspect to it, to be honest, as well. Um, so I don't know. I mean, I agree with your confusion. We live in the same dilemma. So this sounds like a perfect time, since it's almost 6, to see. I'm gonna what I'm gonna do is change so you can unmute yourselves if you want to be able to. Those of you who are here and listening to us, you can unmute and show your video, show yourself if you'd like to, or if you don't want to do that and you want to put something in the chat as a question or comment, concern, thought, feel free. Just gonna give it a moment to see if anyone. Hi.
Julia,
Okay, hold on. I think Emily, okay, you, Robin, you go first, and then Emily, did you want to
No,
say
no,
something
Emily,
too?
you go first. Emily, go first.
Well, okay, it doesn't really matter. Emily, can you unmute yourself though? There you go.
Oh, I think so. Hold on, just
Yeah,
the Bluetooth
you did
headphones are
it.
popping on. It's
We
working.
can hear
Can
you.
me?
We have liftoff.
Hi,
Go for it.
thanks. Yeah, sure. I mean, thanks so much for the chat today. I kind of felt like I stumbled upon this and get to put faces to some names. I somehow I just made a couple notes along the way, and I thought maybe I'd throw out some of my associations to I guess first Jacob's reading, because I just happened to be reading a Susan Sontag Where the Stress Falls collection of essays, and I don't know if you're familiar with the I guess the first part is about just I guess like 19th century Russian poets and how they are kind of a good example of poets that are talking a lot about prose as like the enemy of poetry, and like whatever, that like poetry superiority. And I don't know if I can make the connection properly anymore, but I've gone away with recent kind of humoring that idea for myself about like, well, there's my I guess like, okay, so that we're talking, Jacob was talking a lot about life. Mom. And this is a perfect example.
It's okay. It's life, man. I'm sure Jacob's fine with this. I'm fine with this. We're good.
Sorry. The I guess like that whatever that's I'm always kind of interested in the tension between life and art, and I think that if I think of it in terms of like historical tension between poetry and prose, like I like to just think about for myself recently how the you know, regular day stuff we're so like offended by, because it's just the meat of living, and it's like it's nice. It's been a nice poetic kind of digesting for myself, just thinking about like prose as life, I guess.
I love that. I'll let Jacob respond first if he wants to, though.
It makes me think that in some weird way, it's not enough to want to do something. You have to also want to do something and think it's better than something else. There's like some need to, I totally have this. I'm trying to like catch myself doing this and not, you know, the famous quote, comparison is the thief of joy. But it's totally true. I mean, also, yeah, I started as a poet and a playwright, like as a teenager. I don't really write poems or plays anymore. The poems, you know, became novels, and the plays became performances where there's no writing involved, because I felt like writing things and having other people say them was like less real than having people just say things that they wanted to say. Yeah, and it's always like this, like, yeah, that also that LCD sound system song, Losing My Edge, like, I heard you sold your guitars and bought keyboards because you want to make something real, you want to make a Yaz song. This like this feeling that, you know, you're doing something and there's something else that's better or worse, you know, just over there. And how you see what you're doing, you know, you only see what you're doing in comparison to the other thing, which, you know, makes the thing you're doing visible to you. There's something about that that's very intense and very, yeah, that I find myself doing all the time, whether I want to or not.
You know, what that made me think of, Jacob, and I'll get to your thing in a second, Emily, but it relates, is the Joseph Albers color charts that I absolutely love. I don't know if you've ever seen them, but Emily, but they're colors. So there's colors, and then there's like colors on top of other colors, and you can lift things, and you lift. So this looks like an orange, say, and you've got a yellow next to it, and you lift this, and then there's another color under, say, a red, and that will change the way the orange looks. Like, in other words, you can't, there is no actual color. There's only these relationships of color. I remember when I saw that, I was just mind blown moment of just, understanding that. So that's, I was thinking, like, wouldn't it be lovely if we could see it that way? So like, not pretending there's no relationship between the things, but like, it's not like, oh, that orange is better than that orange or whatever. It's just that they're different in relationship. And but I think it's almost impossible to keep that neutrality. I understand. And it's like, I was thinking, Emily, when you were saying, the will to a manifesto, especially in the 19th century, well, like this idea that you have to like make your stance, poetry is better, or it's bad. And I also, Jacob, what you were doing, like, I did keep writing texts, as you saw one of them. But what I would always say to actors, and still do whenever I direct them, and this is not the same as anyone else ever directs them, but when I direct them, I'm like, you never have to sell a line. That was the way I was like, you can say this, you can undermine this, you can mumble it, you can throw it away, you can crumple up the whole page and throw it. Just your actual response to this line is what I'm looking for, which is really, when you find actors who can do that, it's kind of beautiful, because so you've got this weird mix. So it is this mix of the life and this text. So, but they have to bring themselves to bear against a thing, which is the text. So that's the way I did it. But I became obsessed with the improvisation thing. So I can't even bring myself back to staging. And I find it very hard. I can do it, but it's that sense of but they must improvise it. They can't I can't stage it. Staging is bad, and it's just like, it's fascistic. And it's just really interesting, like that kind of whole thing. But Emily, it was also just so amazing as you're talking to see, and a perfect serendipity for your child to show up. I was like, you couldn't, you can't script that shit, like, but that's the beauty, is like, you're like, and most women, and I mean men too, but definitely women, historically have had to deal with a lot of other shit going on, and then this sort of male, and these are big stereotypes, and but this idea like, oh, you have to be off on your own doing your poetry in a space, and it's like, yeah, that space is supported by you're rich, you got 900 women serving you, blah blah blah, so you're in your little freaking corner writing your poetry, like, that's great if you got all that support, but not everyone does. So then how do you bring that in? Like, how do you bring these, class realities, or these realities, or not even class, gender, whatever, into this? I think it's really important. And I really like that idea of thinking of that as prose. That's nice. It's a great question, thought. Yeah. I don't know if you want to add anything, Jacob, again, or.
Yeah, there's this like still writing plays but not directing them, or then not writing plays anymore, or then doing stuff out on the street, which a lot of performance people I know like, and then like where and then where does it end, or something. It's like, and this search for, if you're a poet, then I love poets novels. I love novels written by people who are previously poets, because I feel there's this like, well, of course, attention to language, but also this like escape from poetry in the poet's novel, or this kind of freedom. Experimental musicians I know who then wrote pop songs, and the pop song is like a very conventional thing, but for these experimental musicians, writing pop songs was like an escape into freedom. So it's not only what you're doing, but like where you're coming from that makes it what it is.
Exactly. It's like the Deleuze comment about the variation. Robin, did you want to say something? You had wanted to. I know. So you unmuted, then muted. You have a question, thought?
Not a question so much as fascinating that, and I'd never thought about this before. And I'm going to have to go back and hear you again, Jacob. At the beginning of this whole conversation, you talked about art as to whether it's real or not real, as the truth, not truth, if you do something, not do something. And it just 60 years ago just came blowing back into my mind. Julia, that's what your father was
wrestling
with all the time. And I think it's one of
I know.
I know. Amazing, because the way you describe, I mean, I've heard this kind of thing described in, let's call it more contemporary times. He was at Rhode Island School of Design in the late 50s and early 60s. But I've never heard it described so plainly and so raw in a sense. And that's the way he described it. And it occurred to me just now that after he graduated, he never made any more art. Well, he did make a painting that I've got downstairs, but he really couldn't create. And I think part of it is he didn't have the structure anymore of the school, but also these debates in his head. He never could resolve them. And I'm wondering, now I'm realizing, listening to you talk, I'm afraid I always dismissed the fact that he was so brilliant and that he never made art, regardless of which way he graduated in sculpture. And I'm beginning to realize now that he never could resolve that issue in his head. And I realize he's not the only person who had that debate. It continues. And I never appreciated it until listening to you, Jacob. And I really want to thank you. It's kind of too late now, but I really want to thank you because it was an aha moment. It's like, oh my God. So thank you. So that's all. It wasn't a question, Julia. It was a revelation for me. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting. Yeah. No, his favorite job, and thanks to Reagan, it got disappeared. But he was happiest working as an art therapist with schizophrenic people. And I remember the photos he has of those, and that was part of what was called CETA. It was career education training in the arts, and it was something during the, I don't know if Nixon did it, but definitely Carter. I don't know. Did Nixon start it? I don't remember.
In 73, 74 during that really session.
Yeah. So Nixon into Ford, oddly enough. But yeah, and that was like this incredible thing. And then after that, he just never could find anything, because it was like that got disappeared, and he was not engineered for capitalism. It was never going to be his friend. So
No.
Yeah, for sure.
It's,
Oh, I just want to make sure, because there's only a few people left. I just want to see if anyone who's still here has a question besides us talking about my father. No, it's fascinating. No, I mean, it is, but to me, but I don't know. Does anyone else want to, or Jacob, actually, do you want to respond to that? Because it was,
Yeah, I mean, something I often say is being full of doubt, but doing things anyway. And I mean, I have no shortage of doubt about everything I'm doing, but it's clear to me I don't want that doubt. I mean, it is paralyzing at times, but it's very clear to me that I don't want my doubts to be paralyzing. I want to be an artist. I want to make art. I'd even prefer to make bad art than not to make art in some way, even though there's another part of me that thinks not making art might be the highest form of art. But even that, if I could do that as making art, then that could be an option. But yes, this like trying to take your doubts and use them as an engine to do things rather than as an engine not to do things is something I'm very interested in, and I'm always trying to figure out how to do.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's the difference right there between people who end up making it or not. I don't mean making it as in a traditional success. I just mean that, like, can you with doubt create? And I think most of the work I've ever seen, I think of writers like George Perec or people like that. I love that. It feels like it's imbued with that kind of thing. Yeah. And all kinds of writers, but that's just the person that came to mind right away. Yeah, no, that's a great way. And that might be a wonderful way to end, unless we got 1 minute left. If anyone has a thing they'd like to close out with, or if you do, Jacob. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Jacob. Amazing conversation. And this will be on YouTube later. So I'm about to stop the recording now, and I'm going to do that.